Week 6 of 2024 fantasy football is in the books, and we are headed straight into Week 7 of the 2024 fantasy football season. So many different wide receivers to choose from. We got so many players on the bench, so many flex options, injuries piling up, 2 more bye weeks here in Week 7. So you know what we need to do. We need to go through every single wide receiver for every single matchup and talk about who we should be starting and who we should be sitting headed into Week 7. Before we do so, let me remind you that Underdog is the place you want to be if you want to get in on additional fantasy football action all season long. Their Week 7 NFL Pick'ems are already live, and Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a free Bo Nix over half of a total yard Pick'em to use towards Thursday night's action. And don't worry, if you guys watch this video later in the week, you'll get an NFL Pick'em to use towards Sunday's action. On top of that, Underdog is giving all new users who sign up with promo code THECATCH a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. So that's a free pick'em for the week and up to $1,000 in bonus cash on Underdog when you sign up with promo code THECATCH. That link is down below. All right, very quickly, we have 2 teams on bye week this week. It'll just be the Chicago Bears and the Dallas Cowboys. So we'll be without the services of DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, and Rome Odunze. For the Bears, in terms of the Cowboys, we'll be without CeeDee Lamb and Jalen Tolbert. So make sure you guys are checking your lineups and adjusting accordingly. So let's kick things off with Thursday night football. We're going to have the Broncos traveling to face the Saints, and this is kind of a gross matchup in my opinion. We got 2 good defenses. I know the Saints gave up a lot of points last week, but overall on the season, they've been a solid defense that's been pretty good against the wide receiver position. We have started to see some flashes out of Bo Nix in his rookie season at the quarterback position. We've got plenty of wide receivers on this team and a lot of volatility in terms of the Broncos and just not wide receivers that we can really trust. But I do think on a weekly basis, you can flex Courtland Sutton. Don't know exactly how safe his ceiling is, but he does have 13 or more fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 matchups, 2 touchdowns in 2 of his last 3 matchups, 15.3 fantasy points in week 6, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 53 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So I try to stay away from Thursday night matchups, but if you got to roll with Courtland Sutton, he should at least be able to get you a safe floor for the week. Marvin Mims, just 3 targets in week 6. Devon Vell, a good game, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 78 receiving yards. I don't know if I can trust him. And Troy Franklin, a player that we talked about in the waiver wire video, came through with 11.6 fantasy points, but just 3 targets, 2 receptions, 31 receiving yards, and a touchdown. He did drop a touchdown in week 5 as well, but not ready to trust any Broncos wide receivers, especially on a short week against the Saints defense outside of Courtland Sutton. Now, I do think that the Saints wide receivers still have some flex value. We kind of got to see what happens with 2 players here. The first player is Chris Olave, who suffered a concussion in week 6. We don't know if he's going to be good to go on a short week here in week 7 or not. The other player we need to take into consideration is Pat Surtain of the Denver Broncos, who also suffered a concussion in week 6. So if Pat Surtain is out, and Chris Olave plays, then I think you can play Chris Olave as well as Rashid Shaheed. If Pat Surtain plays and Chris Olave plays, then I'm not starting Chris Olave. If Chris Olave is out and Pat Surtain's in, then I'm not starting Rashid Shaheed. So this is one of these things where we kind of got to evaluate as the week goes on. We've got Spencer Rattler, rookie quarterback, in for the Saints here. And, you know, this Broncos defense has been good as a whole. It's not just Pat Surtain, but he is the main player that we want to be aware of in terms of starting or not starting wide receivers. So I think I'm going to try and stay away from starting Olave or Shaheed, even in the flex, but we'll see what happens in terms of Pat Surtain as the week goes on. All right, moving into Sunday, we have another London game, the last of the year. It's going to be the Patriots and the Jaguars squaring off. And speaking of rookie quarterbacks, we've got a rookie quarterback starting in New England, and that is Drake May, which has given some life to this passing attack for the New England Patriots. 21.2 fantasy points in week 6 against the Texans for Demario Douglas, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 92 receiving yards, and a touchdown. So Demario Douglas, double-digit fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 matchups. This was really my favorite Patriots wide receiver to draft in the offseason going into the year. It's just been a very stale start for the Patriots offense, but I do think that they're going to start to have some life. And if there's ever a week where they're going to have life, it's this week against the Jaguars, because this defense is the worst in the NFL. I mean, in terms of fantasy points allowed to each position, they are bottom 5. They have been awful all year long. So Demario Douglas is definitely in the flex category. He sits at just 14% rostered, especially if you need a spot play for the week. Douglas should be a very strong start, but he's still kind of in that flex area because we got some volatility in terms of the Patriots offense here. Now, I'm not ready to trust any other Patriots wide receiver. There's just nothing out of KJ Osborne. Jalen Polk, 4 targets, 1 reception in week 6. Kendrick Bourne is back in action, but just 2 targets, 2 receptions. And then we did see a touchdown to Kayshon Boutte, who had 3 targets, 3 receptions, 14.9 fantasy points. But yeah, I'm just not there with the Patriots wide receivers out of Demario Douglas. We got to see a consistent pattern emerge before we play any other Patriots wide receiver. Now, moving along to the Jaguars, we got Brian Thomas Jr. coming off of his worst fantasy performance of the year in week 6. 5.7 fantasy points, 6 targets, 3 receptions, 27 total receiving yards. But this was kind of expected against that Bears secondary that's been very solid so far on the season. He is still a top 10 fantasy wide receiver at this point in time. And we do have a good corner 1 in Christian Gonzalez with the Patriots. But for the most part, if I own Brian Thomas Jr., I'm starting him. The upside's too high. So, yes, the Jaguars were awful in week 6. I think they can bounce back a bit here in the second London game. But concern is definitely high. Now, Christian Kirk, 6.9 fantasy points in week 6, 6 targets, 3 receptions, 39 receiving yards. I think he's still in that flex category. He still has 12 or more fantasy points in 3 of the last 4 matchups. If you have other options that you like more, by all means, if you want to stay away from the Jaguars offense, that's fine. Now, Gabe Davis was the best Jaguars wide receiver in week 6, coming in with 21.5 fantasy points, 2 touchdowns off of 5 receptions. So I'm going to sit Gabe Davis. I mean, come on. Does anyone really trust Gabe Davis? He has 9.2 or less fantasy points in every other game on the season. This is just one of those things that happened. We got a Gabe Davis game. So I do not trust Gabe Davis whatsoever as we approach week 7. All right, moving along to Sunday's afternoon games. Let's start with the Lions traveling to face the Vikings in what should be a good matchup here. And we got plenty of relevant fantasy players here. So obviously, if you own Amon-Ra St. Brown, I know it might feel like he's been slightly disappointing, but he's still been very, very good. I mean, he has 20 or more fantasy points in 3 out of 5 matchups. A bad week 1, and last week he may have just got a garbage time touchdown, but there's no reason to worry if you own Amon-Ra St. Brown. And yes, the Vikings defense is good, but they've given up plenty of fantasy points to the wide receiver position and plenty of total passing yards so far on the season. The secondary is the weaker part of this defense. It's that front 7 that's worrisome. So Amon-Ra's a start. Jameson Williams, way too much upside. I know he had the dud in week 3, but 14.4 or more fantasy points in every other matchup. He leads the team in receiving yards. Jameson Williams, even if he's in that flex area for you based on where you drafted him, he's a must start on a weekly basis the way that this offense looks. Now, we've also got Khalif Raymond hanging around, who did have a good outing in week 6. And we also have Tim Patrick hanging around, who had a pretty decent outing as well. But this was kind of a blowout game where the Lions were in complete control. Like, the Cowboys were on, all Madden mode, and the Lions were on rookie mode. It just wasn't even fair. So, neither of those two guys, Raymond or Patrick, have done anything so far on the season outside of this game. So, no, I'm not starting either of them, but certainly worth watching, especially Tim Patrick. I'm starting to like his role in this offense. Now, obviously, if you own Justin Jefferson, you were starting him. Vikings were on bye in week 6, but he's still a top 5 wide receiver in fantasy football with 15.2 or more fantasy points in every game so far on the year. Do not bench JJ ever. Jordan Addison, I think, is a good start in this matchup. Now, the Lions secondary looked good in week 6. Like, they were bad through the first 3 games in terms of fantasy points allowed. Then they started to tighten up a little bit, but still giving up enough. They looked really good last week, but I think Addison and, what should be a good competitive game script here is a solid start. He's probably in that flex area for you. I like Addison this week. Now, Jalen Naylor has fallen off since, Addison's return after having 3 touchdowns through the first 3 games. Player worth monitoring because this is still a great offense, but we're not starting Jalen Naylor here in week 7. So this should be a good matchup. We'll see what happens. Move along to the Titans traveling to face the Bills. And I feel kind of gross about this game. So we got the Titans wide receivers here who I'm not starting any of them. Calvin Ridley is 76% rostered. DeAndre Hopkins is 60% rostered. I couldn't fathom having either of these players on my bench. And the biggest problem might not be Calvin Ridley or DeAndre Hopkins. It might be the quality of targets that they're getting from Will Levis. But if neither player, Ridley and Hopkins combined for just over 10 fantasy points in week 6 against the Colts. And that was because Hopkins found a way to get 4 receptions in this game. Calvin Ridley, on the other hand, had 8 targets and 0 catches. Just no thank you. No thank you. Sure, every now and then you're desperate. You can throw in Hopkins or you can throw in Ridley and they might get you points. But I'm not playing to maybe get points. Tyler Boyd, on the other hand, 6.3 or less fantasy points every game on the year. Just no thank you. And the Bills' run defense has been pretty weak, to say the least, on the season. But their secondary, for the most part of the season, has been pretty good. So I have no interest in starting any Titans wide receivers. Now, at the time I'm recording this, I have to record these early on Monday. So Monday Night Football has not been played yet. I don't know if Khalil Shakir is suited up or not. I'm expecting if Shakir plays that he won't have a great game because he's banged up. And I would imagine he sees the most of Sauce Gardner. And then we got Keon Coleman. I don't know if he's going to have a great game because he might be the wide receiver 1 if Shakir doesn't play. So, really my viewpoint with the Bills wide receivers is that Shakir is startable, low ceiling, but startable. Every start this year, he has 10 or more fantasy points. Keon Coleman is flexible, but he's a very volatile flex. You look over the last 3 games, not including week 6, once again, he's got 8.1 or more fantasy points and 2 touchdowns in that stretch, but just 5 catches and a total of 10 targets. Just very volatile, low ceiling. You have to be kind of desperate to have to flex him. Mac Hollins, Curtis Samuel, just no interest whatsoever from a fantasy standpoint. They have not done enough on the season. So really, the only player that I would really want to start potentially in this matchup is a healthy Khalil Shakir. Next up, we have the Dolphins coming off of their bye week, traveling to face the Colts. So, what do we do with this matchup? We got Tyler Huntley will be the starting quarterback for the Dolphins. And this is a great matchup. The Colts secondary, the Colts defense, god-awful. God-awful. So, yeah, I think you can start Tyreek Hill. He had 12.9 fantasy points in week 5. If he doesn't score a touchdown, I think he'll probably finish around that area, 11, 12 fantasy points. If he does score a touchdown, then maybe he has a little bit of a higher ceiling, 17, 18 fantasy points. But Hill is startable. I just don't know exactly what I'm expecting out of him. Now, Jalen Waddle, on the other hand, I just can't do it. Outside of week 1, he has 8.6 or less fantasy points so far on the year. So with Huntley at quarterback, I'm just not there. And there's just nobody else on this roster worth mentioning. Odell Beckham, Braxton Berrios, Malik Washington. There's just no production out of these guys. What a disappointing offense we have here in the Dolphins, who we're expecting big things from, obviously. Some circumstances outside of their control. Moving along to the Colts, we're going to have Joe Flacco as the starting quarterback here. So, Yes, I do think this is good for the Colts wide receivers. I'd rather see Flacco start than A-Rich in terms of fantasy, unfortunately. And Pittman is definitely startable, 12.5 or more fantasy points in his last 3 starts. Of course, all of those starts, the primary quarterback throwing to him is Joe Flacco. So I think Pittman, who wasn't going to play, then was going to maybe head to IR and then did play and scored a touchdown. Solid start. Now, the Dolphins haven't been that bad in terms of a pass defense, but I like this, home game for the Colts. Pittman should be fine. Josh Downs is the guy that really interests me, though. Still sitting at 68% rostered. He's going to be a player that starts to move up in roster percentage, and we got some good competitive game scripts coming up for the Colts, hopefully. The Dolphins this week, then the Texans and the Vikings, then the Bills. So Josh Downs a solid start, and I think that Josh Downs probably okay if Anthony Richardson waddles back out there at quarterback. Now, Alec Pierce, and I got a lot of comments about Alec Pierce last week, and told you guys, I like Alec Pierce, but I don't trust him. The volume's been so low. 22.4 fantasy points in week 5 against the Jags. 0 fantasy points in week 6. He has more than 3 receptions in 1 game on the season. He's just so volatile. He's a shot in the dark. It's way too risky. And A.D. Mitchell had a decent outing against the Jags in week 5, but that was the Jags, and he came back to earth against Tennessee with 2.9 fantasy points in week 6. So for me, it's Pittman, it's Downs. Those are the guys we're starting. If you get desperate, like there's nothing out there, you're in a 3 wide receiver, 2 flex league, and you're able to play Pierce. That's one thing, but he's so risky that I'm not going to trust him. And see what happens with the Dolphins, but I think Hill is at least startable in this matchup. Next up, we have the Seahawks traveling to face the Falcons, and I'm feeling good about this game script. Feeling some points in this game. We'll see what happens. Now, DK Metcalf, very disappointing in the last 2 weeks. 7.8 or less fantasy points. Total of 18 targets, but just 7 receptions. I think that Metcalf will be okay. I'm not going to panic here. The Falcons have been pretty good against opposing wide receivers on the season so far. Geno didn't look that great in week 6 against the Niners, but he still threw for over 300 passing yards. There's still reason to be concerned with the Hawks, but Metcalf's still a top 20 fantasy wide receiver, and I have a hard time benching DK Metcalf. Now, JSN has been pretty solid. He has double-digit fantasy points in every matchup this year except for weeks 1 and 3, so 4 out of 6 matchups. I think he's in that flex area, and this has really been my viewpoint all season long with the Seahawks wide receivers, because when you look at Tyler Lockett, same exact boat as JSN, double-digit fantasy points in every game except for 2 on the year. So volatility with JSN and Tyler Lockett, but they'll probably get you points. They're always startable, but just don't be surprised when, they get 3 or 6 fantasy points, right? And Metcalf just still has the higher ceiling, just a tough player to bench. So I do like the game script here, and I think that every Seahawks wide receiver is startable. On the other hand, looking at the Falcons, Drake London just continues to be an absolute stud. 19.4 fantasy points against the Panthers, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 74 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Double digits every game this year except for week 1 against Pittsburgh. He's a must-start player. Darnell Mooney, disappointing in week 6 and a good matchup against the Panthers after having 31.5 fantasy points in week 5. He's been fine, double digits in half of his games, single digits in the other half. It's not the best, not the worst matchup here against the Seahawks, but I just got a good feeling that this game is going to be high scoring. So Mooney, I like this week. I think he's definitely startable. Maybe he's in that flex category, but I'm okay starting Mooney overall. Now, Ray McCloud was a player that I liked going into week 6, and he really disappointed in that matchup against the Panthers, but also like the Falcons wide receivers just weren't really necessary last week because it's so easy to run the football against the Panthers. So give them a little bit of credit, I guess. And I don't know, Ray McCloud is just going to be a sit. Double digits in weeks 4 and 5, and thought maybe he could repeat that against the Panthers in week 6, but he just wasn't necessary and just can't be trusted from a fantasy standpoint, unfortunately. So See what happens, but I'm expecting some points in a good matchup here in week 7 between the Hawks and the Falcons. We got a nice looking matchup between the Texans and the Packers. So we know Nico Collins going to be out this week once again for the Texans. Stephon Diggs, in the absence of Nico Collins, 19.7 fantasy points, 7 targets, 6 receptions, 77 receiving yards, and a touchdown in week 6. He should continue to be very solid. He's a top 10 fantasy football wide receiver. No reason to bench Diggs. And I love Stephon Diggs' current receiving line on Underdog, sitting at 68.5 total receiving yards. He has hit that in every single matchup for the past 3 weeks. It's a good matchup this week against the Green Bay Packers. He's going to be necessary with Nico Collins out. So I would head straight to Underdog and smash the over on Diggs' receiving line. And don't forget, all new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch on Underdog are going to get that free pick 'em for the week. Take your free pick 'em, pair it with Diggs over 68.5 receiving yards, automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000. On the other hand, Tank Dell, in the absence of Nico Collins, finally gave us a ceiling game. 18.7 fantasy points, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 57 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Now, you might be looking at this Packers defense and you might think, I don't know, it's kind of a good defense, a good secondary. And they're good secondary in terms of getting takeaways, but they've given up a lot of total yardage and a good amount of fantasy points to the wide receiver position. And we got to expect some points here between these two offenses this week. So don't be scared of starting Diggs or Dell. Now, Xavier Hutchinson, some people speculating, including myself, that he could get a little bit more involved in the absence of Nico Collins, but that just did not happen last week. Just 2 total targets, 0 catches. It was all Dell, all Diggs last week. So start those guys, and we will sit Hutchinson. You could probably drop Hutchinson if you picked him up. All right, moving along to the Packers. Let's take a look here because this is a tough read, and let's just go ahead and start by saying the Packers wide receivers are very volatile on a weekly basis. Never know what you're going to get, right? So Jaden Reed, I think we start. He got a little banged up in that week 6 matchup against the Cardinals, but if you own Jaden Reed, just keep rolling with Jaden Reed. He's been a top 5 fantasy wide receiver on the year. Safe floor, good ceiling. Jaden Reed, start on a weekly basis. But now, we got a conundrum. We got Christian Watson back from injury, Romeo Doubs back from his suspension, and a banged up Dontavion Wicks, who's week to week with a shoulder injury. So we saw a slight involvement out of Bo Melton with 2 targets and no targets for Malik Heath. So the main guys we need to talk about with no Dontavion Wicks are Watson and Doubs, who I think are going to be in that flex category. Both had double-digit fantasy points and at least 1 touchdown, 2 touchdowns to Doubs in week 6. But they're still risky, very volatile. Just 4 targets to Doubs, 4 targets to Watson. Both had 3 grabs. Good flex plays, nice ceilings. Should be a good competitive game script here with points scored. If you want to start either guy in the flex, that's fine. But just understand it can be very easy to chase points. And if any wide receiver room has shown us that this year, maybe outside of the Niners, it's the Packers. You look at what Wicks did in week 4 and then what he's done since. So a little bit of volatility here, but I do like the game script. Watson and Doubs definitely in that flex area as we approach the week. Except we have the Bengals traveling to face the Browns. And Jamar Chase, I know not the highest ceiling against the Giants in week 6, but you got to start Jamar Chase on a weekly basis. His ceiling on the year, 41.3 fantasy points. Just say no more. 6 targets, 5 receptions, 72 receiving yards, 12.2 fantasy points in week 6. Too good of a player to bench. No way we were benching Jamar Chase. T. Higgins has been great since his return from injury. Little, shaky in his first start back in week 3, but outside of that, 12 or more fantasy points, 14.7 in week 6, 7 targets, 7 receptions, 77 receiving yards. This Cleveland Browns defense does not scare me whatsoever. Now, Yoshi, not really a startable player right now, a player worth monitoring, but that red zone, usage has gone down with Higgins and Chase back in full swing. So, Yoshi, worth keeping an eye on, but just hasn't been fantasy relevant for the past 3 weeks. Now, this might be a little harsh for the Browns wide receivers, but I don't know if it's too harsh. I'm sitting everyone here. I'm sitting Cooper. I'm sitting Judy. If you can trade those guys, trade them. I don't think you can trade Judy for much, but maybe Cooper, especially with trade rumors. And if you want to hold on to him in case he does get traded to a competent offense with a competent quarterback, then that's one thing. Not an awful matchup here against the Bengals, but they've actually been okay against wide receivers. It's really their run defense that's weak. I just can't do it. I talked about this stretch of matchups for the Browns wide receivers so much early in the season. After week 1, the Jaguars, the Giants, the Raiders, the Commanders, the Eagles, now the Bengals, and the Ravens. It's a great stretch, and it's been awful. These guys have not produced for the most part. Surprisingly, Amari Cooper came through in the toughest matchup against the Giants with 2 touchdowns. I just can't do it here. Judy was looking actually pretty consistent through the first 4 games, and then he's come back to earth. Elijah Moore has done nothing on the season, and he's dealing with a rib injury. I'm just done. I'm done with the Browns wide receivers. I don't want to talk about them. They're in the sit category for me in week 7. Along, we've got a much easier matchup here to take a look at. That is the Eagles squaring off against the Giants, and this is basically start them all across the board. A.J. Brown in his return from that hamstring injury, 23.6 fantasy points, 9 targets, 6 receptions, 116 receiving yards, and a great touchdown grab. Smith in his return from suffering a concussion, 15.4 fantasy points, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 64 receiving yards, and a touchdown. These guys are absolute studs. You start them every week. My apologies. I didn't even mention any other Eagles wide receiver on the screen, but you're not starting Paris Campbell or Jahan Dotson. Dotson 3 targets in week 6, but there's nothing there. And I think, Johnny Wilson has actually been cleared from concussion protocol, but he saw just 6% of snaps in week 6. So let's just keep it basic. Brown, Smith, good at football, start them. Now, Malik Neighbors was ruled out for week 6, still dealing with the concussion that he suffered at the end of the game in week 4 against Dallas. And I would expect that Neighbors is good to go here in week 7, but I guess you never know. Obviously, if Neighbors starts, then we're starting him. It's a good matchup against the Eagles, who their pass defense did look a little bit better in week 6, but I don't want to read too much into it because it was the Browns and Deshaun Watson throwing. But yeah, Neighbors, you own him. He plays, you start him basically every single week, right? I mean, should be no discussion there. Rondell Robinson, on the other hand, has double digits in every single game on the season except for that week 2 matchup against Washington where he still at least scored a touchdown. Loved him going into week 6. Still like him. He's a top 30 fantasy football wide receiver. Maybe the ceiling's not crazy high, but Robinson is a strong start. We also liked Slayton going into week 6, but I'm a little worried about him if Neighbors returns. I think this is kind of like a Jawan Jennings type situation where we're really only able to start Slayton if Neighbors or Robinson misses time. He had 11.7 fantasy points in week 6, 11 targets, 6 receptions. Certainly still a path for Darius Slayton in this offense, even with a healthy Malik Neighbors. And Slayton and Daniel Jones have a good chemistry, right? But I just don't know if we can trust him if Neighbors plays. I mean, Neighbors' overall volume and target share was insane when he was healthy. So let's pump the brakes on Darius Slayton a little bit. I don't know if he's necessarily worth dropping if you own him if Neighbors is back, but I don't know if I'm going to start him in week 7 unless Neighbors is out. All right, let's move along to a matchup between the Raiders and the Rams. So, yeah, this is a weird matchup here, but let's start with Jacoby Myers, who was inactive with an ankle injury in week 6. If he's healthy and he plays, I think he's startable, mainly because the Rams' defense in their secondary has been, well, basically non-existent all season long. So if you owe Myers, you need a spot play. I think he's fine. I'm not going to go out of my way to start him, but I think he's okay Aiden O'Connell certainly didn't do anything last week against the Steelers that would inspire me to want to start a Raiders wide receiver. But if Myers plays, I mean, he should be able to get some production. And he's just one of these guys that's okay. And that's about it. Now, Trey Tucker has come back to earth in the last 2 weeks and 2 tough matchups against the Broncos and the Steelers after having double-digit fantasy points in weeks 3 and 4. I think he's flexible, but only because of the matchup. And you'd have to be in like a deep format, like 16 teams. Like you'd have to be in a tough spot to, spot play Trey Tucker this week. But due to the matchup, I think it's doable, but I wouldn't get too excited. And once again, it's a volatile, I'm in a bad spot play. All right, moving along to the Rams. There's some speculation that Cooper Kupp might return this week. I don't think he's going to, but if Kupp plays, it's a great matchup against the Raiders. And you're probably used to, not playing Kupp by now. So you might have other options that you're like, I'm just going to see what Kupp does in his first game back. But at the same time, like I said, it's a really good matchup. So it might be hard to bench Kupp, especially with all the other injuries and bye weeks and everything. So I don't think he's going to be here in week 7, but if he is, then very difficult to bench him. Now, Jordan Whittington, I do like double-digit fantasy points in his last 2 starts. He was dealing with that shoulder injury in week 5, but the Rams had their bye week in week 6. I think he'll be good to go. Great matchup for Whittington. I like him really regardless of if Kupp plays or not. Then we've got Tutu Atwell, who has double-digit fantasy points in his last 3 starts. I like Tutu, but I don't like him if Kupp plays. I don't know if there's going to be enough volume there. But if Kupp doesn't play, Tutu Atwell against the Raiders should be a solid flex play. Don't think that the ceiling is super high here, but he's definitely startable if you're in a bind. Now, Demarcus Robinson's been a little bit too volatile. He did have a touchdown in week 5 in his first double-digit fantasy performance of the year, but it's been pretty rough outside of that. And Tyler Johnson has been just non-existent since week 1. So not starting either of those guys. For me, it's Whittington and Atwell who have the upside here, I guess I could say. But it depends on if Kupp plays or not. So we'll just continue to monitor things as the week goes on. We have the Panthers traveling to face the Commanders. And Deontay Johnson came back to life in week 6 against the Falcons with 19.8 fantasy points, 10 targets, 6 receptions, 78 receiving yards, and a touchdown. Not going to lie, I was starting to lose some faith in this Panthers passing attack, but they showed some life once again. Andy Dalton was okay. Still threw 2 picks. One of them towards the end of the game, and I don't know, he was okay. I think Deontay Johnson is startable. The Commanders have struggled against the wide receiver position so far on the season, so he is startable. But I still worry at the end of the day about this Panthers offense a little bit, but he should be a solid start against the Commanders. Now, Xavier Leggett, a touchdown in week 6, 11.3 fantasy points, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 23 receiving yards. I have him as a sit, but I think you could start him like in a flex area if you're desperate. I just don't really trust Leggett. I mean, last 3 weeks, 19.6, 1.8, 11.3. Just very volatile. It is a good enough matchup that you could start Leggett if you're in a bind. I just don't know that I'm going to go out of my way to do so. In terms of Jonathan Mingo, Jalen Coker, David Moore, everyone else here, I'm just going to stay away from. Not enough production for the rest of these Panthers wide receivers to consider them a start. Now, basically, my thesis with the Commanders wide receivers all year long has been start Terry McLaurin, and there's no one else to start here. Noah Brown has shown some flashes. He did have 9.8 fantasy points this last week, 8 targets, 4 receptions. Zacchaeus, 6 targets, 4 receptions, 6.7 fantasy points. Luke McCaffrey, 1 target, 1 reception, 1.5 fantasy points. Just not enough. This is a run-first offense. Jaden Daniels, Brian Robinson when healthy, Austin Eckler, funnel through Terry McLaurin. Those are the relevant guys, and I guess Zach Ertz too. McLaurin's the only wide receiver that we can consider for the Commanders moving into week 6. And I do think that he's a very solid start. All right, next up, we have the Chiefs traveling to face the Niners in a rematch of this past year's Super Bowl. And I think it's going to be a good matchup. I'm expecting some points in this matchup. So, Xavier Worthy, strong start, a little bit volatile, but the Chiefs are going to need him. He should be a good start. 11.8 fantasy points in his last start, double digits in 3 out of his 5 starts on the season. The Chiefs coming off their bye week. And the last time we saw the Chiefs play, Juju Smith-Schuster at 20 fantasy points. 8 targets, 7 receptions, 130 receiving yards. Now, I do think Juju needs to be rostered, sitting just 33% rostered, and is a good start this week, but let's tamper our expectations. I don't quite know that he's going to ball out once again and have 20 fantasy points, but for what it's worth, he did look very good in that Week 5 matchup against the Saints. In terms of everyone else here, McCole Hardman, 4 targets, 4 receptions in Week 5. You'd have to be really desperate. He's the next best option at 7.3 fantasy points. You have to be really desperate in like a 16-team league. Justin Watson, Sky Moore, no targets or receptions in Week 5. So we're not starting either of those guys. Moving along to the Niners. Debo is the guy on a weekly basis that I say to start. And yes, the Niners might have the most frustrating wide receiver room in the entire NFL. So Debo's last 3 starts, 10 fantasy points, 3 fantasy points, 20 fantasy points. I mean, this is what you get. You drafted a volatile wide receiver who's got a lot of upside, but you got to play through the lows and the highs. So I do like Debo. It is a tough matchup. The Chiefs defense is very, very good. But yeah, if I own Debo, I'm starting him. Now Ayuk, I mean, what do we do with Brandon Ayuk? I think he's flexible. I won't blame you guys if you just want to sit Brandon Ayuk. I mean, similar to Debo, you're playing through highs and lows, but there's been way more lows than highs with Brandon Ayuk so far on the year. So, yeah, you can always start him. As soon as you bench Brandon Ayuk, he's going to have, 15, 20 fantasy points. And whenever you start him, he's going to have 5.7 like he did this past week in a shootout against the Seahawks. So, I mean, Ayuk's just a flex and a volatile flex at that. And that's it. I'm not going to try and go out of my way to start Ayuk, but if you have to, just roll with the punches. Now, Jawan Jennings, another very volatile guy here who I don't think you have to drop, because if we do see an injury to Debo or Ayuk or even Kittle, then Jawan Jennings is going to see some more volume. But until then, we just can't start Jawan Jennings. It feels like so long ago when he had 46.5 fantasy points, but yeah, I just don't think we can start Jennings anytime soon. We will have the Jets traveling to face the Steelers, and this should be a pretty defensive matchup. And once again, as a reminder, I have to record these videos early on Monday, so I don't know how the Jets looked on Monday Night Football or if there's any major injuries or anything, but I think for the most part, we're probably still starting Garrett Wilson. He's got the, one bad matchup against the Broncos, and once again, I don't know how he looked against the Bills, but for the most part, you own Wilson. The ceiling might not be crazy high, but he should be a solid start. I think that Allen Lazard is startable in the flex. The time I'm recording this, Wilson's the wide receiver 32, and Lazard is the wide receiver 25. Now, that might change by the time you guys watch this video, but Lazard's been pretty solid, 10 or more fantasy points in every matchup except for Week 2 against the Titans. I don't know that his upside is crazy high, but he does see volume. 8 or more targets in 3 out of 5 matchups so far on the year. He's startable. Not the best, not the worst matchup against the Steelers. And we'll just leave it at that. I don't want to start Mike Williams. He'd have to have like a insane Monday night performance for me to want to even start to consider playing Mike Williams, who has been definitely the wide receiver 3 on this team and not extremely relevant. Now, moving along to the Steelers, I'm just benching George Pickens. Like, what do we do with Pickens? He has 3 dud performances, 3 good performances with 10 or more fantasy points, but the ceiling's just so low. This offense is so weird. This is a bad matchup. He's probably going to get the Sauce Gardner treatment. I just have no interest in starting Pickens this week. He gets another tough matchup against the Giants in Week 8. And he does have a good stretch. If you're a Pickens owner and you're losing faith, after the bye week in week 9, he gets the Commanders, the Ravens, the Browns, the Bengals, the Browns, the Eagles, the Ravens. That's a really good stretch. But yeah, I'm just not going to trust George Pickens here in week 7, unfortunately. Calvin Austin, no thank you. Van Jefferson, no thank you. They both have had 5.6 or less fantasy points in their last 3 starts. No thank you. And I'm going to bench George Pickens this week. Let me know what you guys think. Moving along, we have the Ravens traveling to face the Buccaneers in what should be a good matchup, high-scoring matchup. This was going to be fun. So let's start with the Ravens. Zay Flowers, a very solid start. Talked about him a lot the past 2 weeks. As a player that I really liked. I really guess I've talked about him a lot the past 4 weeks because I was really encouraging you guys to trade for him in weeks 3 and 4. So you look at the game scripts in those games, he just wasn't necessary. The Ravens were running the football down the Cowboys in the Bills' throats. And then the last 2 weeks, we got better game scripts, weaker secondaries, all that stuff. And he's, come back to life. In games where Zay Flowers has 9 or more targets on the season, he has double-digit fantasy points. And the 2 games where he did not get the targets, 4 or less targets, he does not have double-digit fantasy points. So it's a good matchup against the Bucs. This defense is really allowing a lot of total points. I like Zay Flowers a lot this week. He's a solid start. Rashad Bateman was a player I talked about going into week 6 as a guy who had some sneaky upside if you needed a spot play, and he finished with 11.1 fantasy points. He has double-digit fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 matchups, 2 touchdowns in 2 of his last 4 matchups, 4 targets, 4 receptions, 71 receiving yards in week 6. He's flex-worthy due to the matchup and because I like this game script, but maybe temper your expectations. It is still Rashad Bateman at the end of the day, but maybe startable. Nelson Aguilar, just no thank you. There's nothing there for Nelson Aguilar, unfortunately. Now, moving along to the Bucs, Mike Evans got a little bit banged up. He's not on, listed as injured or anything, and was able to play a bit more in week 6, but just never has a good outing against the Saints and Marshawn Lattimore. So if he pops up on the injury report, then we'll monitor it, but I don't think that's going to happen. So Mike Evans, if you own him, he's a solid start this week. The Ravens secondary has struggled on the season. They're a good run defense. They're not a good pass defense. So I expected Mike Evans to have a bad game in week 6. If you watch Sunday morning's video, I told you guys to straight up bench Mike Evans. Hopefully you listen. Now, when it comes to Chris Godwin, he is having just a monster season. 11.6 or more fantasy points in every game on the year. 35.5 in week 6, his best fantasy day to date on the season against the Saints. 13 targets, 11 receptions, 125 receiving yards, and 2 touchdowns. Do not bench Chris Godwin. He's going to have another solid week here against the Ravens. Sterling Shepard is a guy, if you're really desperate in a deep format, you could take a look at, but you're not going to expect more than 7 or 8 fantasy points because since he's been, pulled up from the practice squad, that's all he's done. But this offense is throwing the football a lot. If you're desperate in a deep league, you could go and spot play Shepard, but for the most part, he's a sit. Jalen McMillan, Trey Palmer, Ryan Miller, nothing else here. Evans, Godwin, the guys that you want to start for the Bucs. And that'll bring us to the final game of the week. That's going to be the Chargers traveling to face the Cardinals, and certainly some interesting names here. I do have a little bit of worry about this matchup, but not as much for the Chargers. I do think that Quentin Johnston is startable. He got a little banged up in week 6, but was able to return to the game. He's listed as questionable at the time I'm recording this, so we'll keep an eye on it, but I expected him to have a bad game against Denver in week 6, and, Pat Surtain left the game and still had a bad game, but he was banged up. He's a guy sitting at 36% rostered who did have double digits in 2 of his first 4 starts. Very volatile. That's why he's got the asterisk, also because he's a little bit banged up. He's startable because it's the Cardinals, but I certainly don't want to trust him. Now, Ladd McConkey, on the other hand, also startable, flexible. Maybe Quentin Johnson should be in the flex area too. And Ladd McConkey also got banged up in week 6 against the Broncos. 8 targets, 4 receptions, 43 receiving yards, and 8.3 fantasy points. So keep an eye on Johnston's health and Ladd McConkey's health as the week progresses. We'll see what happens. And then Josh Palmer is also a sit. Maybe in a world where Johnston and Ladd McConkey are both out, we could spot play Josh Palmer. That's why he's got the asterisk, but I don't even think I like that move that much. Josh Palmer's been very, very disappointing so far on the season. So I'm not going to go out of my way to start any Chargers wide receivers, and I'll just leave it at that. But there's potentially some value there. All right, so Marvin Harrison Jr. suffered a concussion in a Week 6 matchup against Green Bay. We got to monitor his health as the week goes on. I think he's definitely a start if he plays. If he does not play, then I think Michael Wilson is a solid start. Nothing crazy. Probably should be in the flex area. Michael Wilson has double digits in 3 of his last 4 matchups. So, like, he's one of these players that you can pick up, and he should give you points, but that's about it. I like him more if Marvin Harrison Jr. doesn't play. If MH Jr. does play, then Michael Wilson will probably still get you something, but it's like, I don't know. I just don't feel that great, and I think that this Chargers defense could end up having a really solid day. So we'll see what happens, but MH Jr. definitely a start if he plays. Too difficult to bench. Michael Wilson could have some nice value this week. Greg Dortch has just done next to nothing on the season. 4.6 fantasy points in week 6. We're not starting him, even if MH Jr. misses the week. So kind of a gross Monday Night Football matchup here. We'll see what happens. And that'll do it for today's video. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever moving into week 7 of the season, drop it down below. I'll answer every single comment on this video before Thursday Night Football and before Sunday's slate of games. And don't forget, as the week goes on, we're going to have everything that you need here on the channel for week 7 of the season. Starts, sits at every single position, buy low targets, players that you can't bench, players with sneaky upside, must start kickers, must start defenses, fantasy Q&A live streams, everything that you guys could possibly need to bring home a dub in week 7. So make sure that you guys are subscribed so that you don't miss out on any of the content. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.